Howdy, folks. Welcome back to the podcast. Today, Katie and I are excited to talk about whether or not it gets easier having more children, or if it gets more challenging, more complicated. But before we dive into that conversation, I do want to thank each and every one of you that have taken the time to leave a rating or a review on Spotify or on iTunes or whatever platform you listen to us on. Or if you do watch us on YouTube, when you subscribe or like the video or leave comments, that also is very encouraging, and it does help our podcast reach more people. But even more than that, so yeah, those things are also encouraging, but it's so fun when we meet people that have found out about our podcast, because almost always they've heard about it from a friend. And so thank you to those of you that have shared it with your family and with your friends, that have texted it to people, and so on. So it's, yeah. Oh, thank you. That's all I have to say. Thank you so much. And with that said, we will get today's episode going.
The Now That We're a Family podcast.
Well, I know that this is kind of a delay of game because you're dying to know, is it easier to have one child or five, or, really that's the max of our experience. So we can't go on from there. But I did want to let you guys know, if you enjoyed the episode with my mom that we did the other day, I did include a mini podcast, or I did create a mini podcast, I should say, that's a private podcast with more excerpts of that interview. So if that's something that you've been looking for, then you could find that link down in the description box. Now, talking about kiddos.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, recently we recorded an episode on kind of our thoughts around family planning, and that brought up the conversation around, head count, really. Like what is a number that we feel like we can manage, and then is that even the question to be asking? And I do think that, I loved having that conversation, and I think both of us came away from that conversation feeling like we shared what we cared about, we shared our hearts, but also not wanting to, in retrospect, and I haven't listened to the whole thing, but we also want to just be like firm, forever, advocates of families, of large families, of having children. And I do think, pragmatism can get in the way. Sometimes our own logic, our own reasoning can, I shouldn't say get in the way, but it can hinder our growth and our fruitfulness as Christians. And so, we were using our own reasoning. We were using kind of our own thoughts, but at the end of the day, we think children are a blessing. We think God would never give you more children than what he will then equip you to steward and to manage and to bring up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. And we do think that, like, regardless of whether or not you desire children, they are a good thing to pursue. And oftentimes we will wait until our desires align with God's word before we take action on what we think his word says. And that's the opposite. I think we should take action on what God's word says and pray, yes, that our desires are conformed to his word and that our sentiment reflects his word. But I think, families and children and all those things are one of those things that there is an element of always trusting the Lord and just believing they're a blessing and leaning into that, whether or not your own understanding, is in line with that, right? Anyway, so we've been talking head count, we've been talking children, and that's kind of what led to this conversation.
Yeah, I think also we did get a question from a listener that kind of spawned a conversation. Do you have that with you? Maybe you could read that too.
I have it pulled up.
Sweet.
I was going to read it. Should I do that?
Now's a good time.
Okay.
Yeah,
well, and it's fun because just the other day I was driving home from book club, my monthly book club. That's a big part of my life. And I was driving with my friend Derek. I was bringing him back to his car, and he and his wife just had their sixth child recently within the last couple of months. And so I was asking him how that's been, the transition from 5 to 6. And he's like, man, it's just crazy. This has been the easiest transition yet. He goes, this is the first time we've gotten home with our brand new baby. And we felt like, that feeling of you're missing somebody. And I was like, that's crazy, because it's usually always the opposite.
It
right?
usually hits for us, I'd say, around 9 months, where we all come into the dinner table and kind of look around and are like, everybody's here.
Yeah.
We don't need to call anyone up from downstairs. The whole family's here. And then Elisha and I look at each other and are like, well, maybe we are missing somebody.
Yeah. Yeah. And so it was fun to hear that. And I think that, again, in our experience, we only have the 5 children right now. But it has, especially after 3, gotten simpler in a way, and therefore easier in some ways to have more children, I think, and to really just pour your time and energy into them. And I think that comes from being intentional in how you're spending your time and the decisions you're making. But it was fun to hear from another, I mean, he's my age, they're once again in a similar stage of life that we're in, and yet they're embracing children in such a God-honoring way. And because they are united, I feel like as a couple, they can say like, oh, this is great. Like, of course there are, I'm sure, going to be some, practical challenges, but their heart is towards their children and they're embracing it together, which is really fun to see. And the question that Katie was referring to came from a listener. Once again, thank you to all of you that take the time to submit questions, because this is such good food for thought for Katie and I. Even when we don't, do Q&A episodes, I still feel like these questions get talked about in our home on a weekly basis. So somebody submitted a question, and it sounds like this is a gal, a mother. She goes, "Hey, I want, do you have any advice for?" Okay, I'm going to do this. You ready? Do you have any advice for what to focus on with your time and parenting efforts when you have only one child? Are there things you wish you would have done differently or gotten dialed in with your first before having your second? And then for context, she says she has a 16-month-old, but she really hopes that it's not the only child. But in the meantime, she feels confused about how to best use her time being one-on-one with her child. So I thought this would be an interesting thing to hear you reflect on, Katie, because you were in that boat. I mean, I guess you didn't have a 16-month-old, but you had, some months there just having one.
12-month-old, yeah.
Yeah, 12-month-old. And what was that like for you?
Yeah, so I thought this question was interesting because you just have to know that you're probably in one of the trickier seasons of parenting when it's just one child and one adult, or, on two adults, because you're the only playmate that your child has. You're the only interest that they have. And so they just want to follow you around and want to be engaged. Whereas when you add a new baby to a home that's already really hustling and bustling, then stuff's getting dropped on the floor 24/7 for them to go crawl over and be curious about. It is a choking hazard as well. So there's that. But, I feel like Lionel, I never have to engage Lionel ever, because he's just crawling around following his other siblings. He comes to me when he's hungry, when he's got a dirty diaper, when he got stepped on, or like if I need to grab him from falling down the stairs. There's he still needs mommy, obviously, but I don't need to engage him. And the other thing is a lot more is just picked up now. So if you put a lot of time and effort in training your older children, then you're really setting up that expectation in your home of what's acceptable, what the standard is, for obedience, for attitudes, for sibling interaction, all those things. And so the younger child, you'll still need to train, but they will fall into following the healthy peer pressure or the unhealthy peer pressure. So maybe to answer the first part of the question, in terms of where do you spend your time, any time that you're spending training your child to be happy and independent and enjoy other people, know how to behave socially, know how to behave at home, and just in general be a delight, it's going to make it easier when you bring another baby into the family, because that oldest child is going to set the example for the rest of your kiddos. And you have the most time right now. Your attention is the most undivided right now with this baby.
Yeah, it does seem like you just have a golden opportunity to set the culture, to set the trajectory of your home, and you are going to reap the benefits of that. If the Lord blesses you with more children down the road, there'll be this momentum that you already have, or a direction that your home is heading down. And this goes not just for parenting, but for marriage and for your home culture in general. Your kids really do climb on board the culture that you have established in your home. And each individual, it doesn't change the culture, it just kind of illuminates the culture that's there. And so if you've got a bickering marriage, or if you've got a marriage where the conversation's seasoned with joy and love and salt, that's going to come out in the children. If you are diligent with your time, I think that's going to start, your kids are going to adopt that. And so I'm sure many of our listeners can relate to the self-evaluation that takes place when you have children, right? When you're like, okay, wait, what do I actually, when you see your children behaving in a way that's mimicking you really have to reflect on what attributes you want to pass on to your children. And so, yeah, having one child, it really is cool that you have this opportunity to instill the Word of God in their heart, to instill habits, hobbies, just like disciplines in their life that hopefully you'll be able to reap the benefit of down the road with more children, because you get momentum on your side. And I certainly see that in our home.
Yeah, something that I talk about in the Get It All Done Club, we have a mini course on establishing your foundational threshold. And I think that this is really important when you have one child, is continuing to stretch yourself and grow yourself and increase that foundational threshold. So your foundational threshold is the amount of things that you can get done in a day without feeling like you're drowning. And you will see a mom of 10 kids and think, wow, how does she do all of that, right? I think that for sure. And she has been able to increase her foundational threshold where she is able to get a lot of things done without drowning. Some people never really get that threshold increased, and so they do always feel like they're sinking. But I would really encourage you in a season in life when you would like to add on more kids, add in extra things that are optional that you can then cut out when you have another baby. Elisha mentions diligence with your time. And I just think being really diligent with your time right now is going to be one of the best things to prepare you for having another child into the home, another child in the home, just being good with your time, being good with managing your home, being good with doing a lot of extracurricular things maybe right now that you can cut out when you have a new baby. You will find that it's actually really easy to bring a second child into the home because you've already increased that threshold, so you're capable of getting a lot of things done. So when you cut out the extra hobby or you cut out the extra hospitality stuff that you have been doing, it makes instant room for you to take care of that second or third baby without any added stress to your life. So that's something I would encourage. And something that I think we did really well with Leon, and I wish, I want to have that same level of consistency, but just training that first time obedience. And, at 2 years old, he was just a little dream baby in terms of we had 3 kids, but I tell him to stop. I tell him, anything when we're out in public, and he just did it. He just did it on a dime. And so I wasn't, that freed me up to worry about the other 2 kiddos. If you have a bunch of little kiddos running around and no one's listening, that's a very stressful season. And so anyways, I'd say that's something too. If your child's just super obedient, it's going to really help free you up when you have other kiddos.
Yeah, I love you saying filling your time, maxing out your calendar or your day, because it's going to get filled up with something. And when you see, you mentioned, the mother or the father with 10 children, it's man, they're every hour, every minute, every 15-minute chunk of their day seems like it's being optimized for their home or for their life. But you can't just decide to be cut. You can't decide to just start acting that way. You really need to grow into that. And I love the quote. I don't know if it's Zig Ziglar or John Maxwell or one of the guys, Jim Rohn, that says, the harder you are on yourself, the significantly easier life will be on you. And I think of that in these times for us now. I think of that, we'd love to have more children. And so in those times where I feel like our bandwidth is maxed with our current set of children, I'm oh, well, what are ways I can be harder on myself so that life is then significantly easier on me in the future? And we've been able to see this, and I'm sure everybody could probably find an area of their life where this is the case, where you were disciplined with your health for many years. You were hard on yourself, so to speak, with your workout regimen, and years later you're reaping the reward of it. You have more energy, right? You're not dealing with as much, chronic pain or illness because of the discipline you had in your life 10 years ago. Same financially, right? That's something I think really calculates for people. It computes. It's oh, I'm not going to buy that thing now, so that my future, the life's easier on me in the future. But same goes for child training. Same goes for your marriage. The harder you are, and that meaning, I feel just the more work you put in now, the more intentionality you show now, the significantly easier life will be on you in the future. And I loved in the recent interview you did with your mom, and I know most of that's, I think, only in the Get It All Done Club, but part of it I know we shared here on the podcast, and I can't remember if this part was on the podcast or the other part, but she was talking about just her need for continued growth, from the time, and that's not a bad thing, right? It's not oh, I just want to get to the finish line and coast. I think oftentimes we feel that, like, I just want to coast. And I do think that's why it is important to schedule Sabbaths into your life, because if growth is a part of your life, work's going to be a part of your life forever, then you need to proactively schedule rest into your life as well so that you can have a sustainable life. Anyways, just hearing her mindset around growth, that, yeah, there were unique challenges when she had just the one child that she needed to grow into. Then same with 4 children, and then 7 children, and then 9 children, and then 11 children, and then teenagers, and then now her children are married, now grandchildren, and now she's, her mother-in-law passed away, and then her mother's, getting up there in the years, and the challenges and the complications with that are unique to the season of life that she's in. A marriage presents new challenges, as you grow through different seasons, and so the sooner you just start flexing that muscle of growth, and then expect that it's going to be a part of your life, I do think you're able to embrace these seasons and maximize them for what hopefully you can get out of them.
Yeah, as you say that, another one of Elisha's and my favorite quotes that we've repeated over and over to ourselves over the years are, you get to choose between the pain of discipline or the pain of regret. And essentially it aligns with the quote you just shared. The harder you are on yourself, the infinitely easier life will be on you, because we can choose that pain of discipline, or we can choose the pain of life just hitting us and wishing that we'd started 3 years ago something. And I've experienced both pains,
Yep.
and go in and out of experiencing both pains. And sometimes I'm like, I am just experiencing the pain of regret so hard right now. And when you're experiencing that, what you want to do is just keep coping instead of being like, okay, well, what discipline can I actually add to my life right now to be harder for this season, but it's going to make the next season easier.
Yeah.
And so I think that's something that just really applies to motherhood and parenthood and growing your capabilities, because kids grow us in so many ways.
Yeah.
Emotionally, physically, just mentally, all of it.
We love live music in our home. I think you would love live music in your home if you don't already enjoy it in your home. And that's why we made Voberg Music Academy. Check out the coupon below and you get a special discount for being a listener of this podcast, and you can bring live music into your home. Piano, guitar, fiddle, mandolin, ukulele. If any of those instruments sound like fun to you to learn or to have your children learn, go check it out. Yeah, and even as I'm considering that quote, the harder you are on yourself, the infinitely easier life will be on you. I think I've always pictured that in a more macro context, like, if you do the hard things for these 5 years, then the next 20 years you'll reap the return. But it's funny because I feel like I'm seeing that to be the case on such a micro level these days, where it's like, oh man, you get up when the alarm goes off an hour before the kids. You're harder on yourself in that moment, but the day's so much easier for you. Like, even for me now, it's like, because I don't know if it's my old age or what it is, just the season of life I'm in. It's like I feel the effects of what I eat far more instantly now, right? Like maybe not an hour after I eat, but I know, like, if I eat something that's not great for my health for lunch, I will feel that all afternoon into the evening, and so it's like being harder on yourself even on those micro levels, where it's like, no, this healthier breakfast is actually going to make life far easier on me in the afternoon. Same goes with the exercise. Like, I'm going to be harder on myself today, and then I get to reap the reward almost instantly. And it goes with child training too. Boy, like, how often do you do the whole, like, you painted this picture recently, Katie, where you're like trying to parent or manage everything from out there, like you're not embracing it. And boy, that's so the case with parenting oftentimes, where you're trying to manage the bickering in your kids, or their disobedience, or maybe their hard-heartedness, kind of by just like treating it like it's out there, versus you could apply this quote of being harder on yourself. You're like, no, I'm going to fully embrace this. I'm going to actually put my work down. I'm going to step aside from, we're going to pause our conversation, or, even pull over the car, right? Like, how easy is it just to, like, be kind of like griping back at the kids, hey, knock it off, versus taking the extra minutes to pull over, get out of the car, and then find a solution to the problem with your children. And anyways, so I was just saying how, like, I feel like that quote applies. I'm seeing it far more applicable on the micro scale than even before, where I'd always view it on the more macro scale.
Yeah. So if I were to think, like, okay, is having more kids easier or harder? I would say if you have one child, I believe it would be easier to have two. In our experience, 2 and 3, it was much more easier. Much more easier. And then there are elements like right now, I would say at this stage of our kiddos' development, it's definitely easier to have 5 than it was to have 3 or 4. The funny thing is some people say, oh, 4 is where it started getting easier for me. 4 was the hardest for me out of any number of children. And I really think the age has a lot to do with this. By the time most people are having 4 kids, or at least the women I've talked to, their oldest is about like 7 or 8. And so it makes sense. Like you're hitting this stage where your oldest is kind of starting to help out, be a little bit more independent, entertain the others just naturally by their ideas and stuff like that. And when we had 4, our oldest was 4. And so it was just a lot of dependencies all at one time. And so that was really challenging. Like it definitely did not get easier at 4. But then for whatever reason, we hit 5 and our oldest we have a 7 and a 6-year-old now. And just their capabilities, their helpfulness, now I can shower, no problem, and say, hey, call me if something's wrong. Or, they keep an eye out for each other. They go out on the trampoline and will play for hours by themselves. So it's really been a blast to have the 5 kids. At this season. I would say this is the easiest life has been child rearing wise since we started.
That is crazy to think about because 4 kids, 4 and under, that was quite a little season there. And then now we've got our 5 children, but the 4 oldest are so obviously you pour into them and so you have your intentional time of doing school, or we do our music lessons, we do our family reading time, but you and I get like chunks of like hours consistently where we're just talking and uninterrupted because the kids are all playing, with each other out in the backyard. And I mean, that happened today already, you know, like and we were able to have uninterrupted time for about an hour while they were all, and we weren't like banishing them to the, corners of, they just went and kept themselves, they were all just playing. It was how it was. Yeah. And so that makes sense that season was a trying one, relatively to the one that we're currently in.
Yeah. So it'd be funny to say like, 5 kids is easier than 1. But, even what you were talking about with Derek the other day is when you become a parent. So I read that statistic. I shared it on the podcast when we were talking about fertility and deciding when to be done having kids or not, or how that all works. That an interesting statistic that parents are most fulfilled and happy as parents with 4 or more children. And I think a lot of that has to do with what you're talking about with Derek, and that like you really have to embrace parenting at 4 plus kids. You cannot have your own life outside of family. You always have to consider family at that point.
Right. It's like at the central part of your life,
like
now.
Your identity, like it's first in Christ, obviously, but like your identity as far as how you're known and where your time's going, the majority of it is going into your family, whether that's like providing for your family, taking care of your home for your family, coming up with activities for the kids, training, social interaction, hanging out with other families.
Right.
It's just all, your family is your hub.
Yes.
And I think you can create that probably with 2 kids or 1 child or 3 children, but it's forced around the 4-child stage. You don't have much of a choice.
Yep. Yeah. I mean, I think of when you and I just had the one, we really didn't make any modifications to our life. We would just bring our 1 child with us, and we would stay out as late as we wanted to, even at friends' houses, and we would go find a place to put them to bed. Right.
Bring a pack and play.
Bring a pack and play. Exactly. And so we would socialize just as much. I'd say even things like skiing or me, going golfing or playing basketball. We like did the same. I mean, maybe not the same, but like if we wanted to do it, we'd find a way to do it. Because even finding a babysitter is far easier if you have 1 or 2 children. And so you can say yes to a lot more, and then you kind of find something to do with the kids, right? You find a babysitter, you drop them off at your in-laws, and then your parents. And then the more children you have, the more you realize, you know what, we should just say no to that, or I don't want to go to that. I don't think it's best for us to go to that event. And through saying no, you find yourself actually enjoying your life far more. And you're like, oh man, now that we're at home, and you might think you're forced to be there. And anytime you think you're forced to do something, it's not going to be as enjoyable. But that's what's so cool about God's blessings is like he will sometimes through circumstances kind of force us into a season where you get so much more joy out of it. And you're like, why didn't we just do this in the first place?
Well, you start picking things too that are just more conducive to the age and stage of your children. At least we've found that to be the case. And so like, this weekend we're going to a family mountain bike race on someone's property. So it's like the kids are all going to have a blast. Elisha and I are going to have a blast. It's going to be a big social fun time, but we choose activities that are like very conducive to having a lot of kids around.
Yeah.
And so everyone just has a lot of fun because the activity is set up for that. Instead of maybe you can still fit a round hole into a square peg with a couple children.
Yeah.
And that you're able to bring them to events where maybe it's not ideal, but you can do it.
Right.
And just the bigger your family gets, the less you're willing to do that. So
yeah, so I do think there is something to be said about like when you're almost forced into this season of really focusing on your home, optimizing your activities for the sake of the family, you find yourself enjoying it more. And then when you compare it at that point to the alternative, like to maybe what you thought you wanted to be doing with your time, or maybe what you used to enjoy doing more, you're like, man, it doesn't compare. This is so much better. This is so much more fulfilling. And so I do think that, and it doesn't always happen. Some people are reluctant to embrace kids even when they have, a lot of children, and they hang on to some of those things that actually keep their life more complicated and make it more stressful. But I would say that is a common trait of big families that help them enjoy it more and actually make their life easier on some level is they're kind of forced to say no to all these peripheral things that then helps them enjoy far more their home life.
Yeah, I remember growing up, my dad had this theoretical book title called 10 is Easier Than 2. And it was, at the time we had 10 kiddos in our family. And I don't know if he would say the same thing now because they've got a lot going on. But at the time, it was kind of following this theory that 10x is easier than 2x, and that it's easier to 10 times your business than it actually is to double it. Because when you have a goal that is 10 times what you are achieving right now, you require massive shifts in your mindset and the action that you're taking. Like you have to do life totally different, and you have to recreate yourself instead of just like doubling your business. I mean, it's still a great lofty goal, right? That's what you think, but then you don't really take big steps and you just kind of do the same thing. And so it's kind of the same concept when it comes to children. Sometimes that whole cheaper by the dozen concept of like, I am going to massively embrace this. I'm just going to be the family person. Like that is what I'm going to be. It requires you to get really, really good at that instead of just being like, well, I can just live life and have kids along.
Wow.
Sometimes that's more difficult. So there's people who do it very, very well at every stage. We're just saying it doesn't necessarily get, it's not like a math equation where every number gets progressively that much more difficult. Like it's going to take the same amount of time and effort that you're pouring into one child that it is going to take. You need to double that, and then you need to triple that, and then you need to quadruple that. That's not how it works. My mom has this statement: 1 takes all your time, 2 takes all your time, 3 takes all your time, 4 takes all your time. And I really do think that's true as a parent.
Yeah, I love, Katie, thinking about that 10x is easier than 2x principle that we've talked about in regards to business. But you said you have to recreate yourself if you're going to hit those goals, those numbers. 2x, you think you can just kind of like do more of the same. You're like, I'm going to be the same person, just a better version of myself. And so I'm going to, whatever, do a little bit more, do more of what I'm currently doing, and it'll get me to 2x this thing. But with 10x, you have to reconsider everything. And I think of that even within the context of our home and our family life. The greatest things that have happened in our home, I think, have been when we've decided to completely recreate parts of our life or who we are as people, our appetites. We've talked about our ability to change our appetites. And so if you've got a habit or an appetite or a desire that actually just doesn't serve your home very well, you actually have the ability to change that appetite. And I think, getting our kids away from screens was one of those big ones, right? Where we were like, okay, we can't keep doing this where it's dinner time, movie, and then you're just scrambling to bed, and you do that time and time again, right? You can do that with 1 kid, 2 kids, 3 kids, and the pain kind of started to compound in the lack of maybe discipline or systems we had around screens. And so we went screen free. I think at the 1,000 hours outside, we had to completely recreate our family culture, our identities, as for even you and me. Like, we weren't all winter long spending multiple hours outside, and yet you made that a part of your identity. And so I love taking that idea of you have to 10x versus 2x even in regards to your family. And again, that doesn't mean numerically necessarily, but I think having that mindset that, okay, if you've got your 2 children or you've got your 4 children and you want a really healthy family culture, a lot of times it's actually easier to have a 10x mindset where you're like, we're actually going to change everything, and it's going to make our home culture more enjoyable. It's going to be more fruitful. And we'll just have more fun in the process versus, and I think of this personally for me, like some of the things, I mentioned golf. I think guys can go through their hobbies. They can go through, sports media is a big one, or video games or movies, or you go through just time with friends, things that you're like, I know it's like the thought of not having it will like not be considered. You're like, well, I know I need that. And you're like, well, no, everything's on the table. Let's put everything on the table. And if you know that you can change your desires, that means you can actually change your desires to not even want that thing at some point in the future, or you can replace that with a hobby or an activity that serves your family in a far greater way. And again, I actually am really convicted saying this because I think there are things that are coming into my brain now where I'm like, that's not serving our family, and yet I've accepted that I just need it in my life, or I want it in my life, and since I want it, I'll do it every once in a while, and it's fun and it's harmless, it's innocent. This isn't a sin, but I know deep down it doesn't serve our home. It's like, well, man, put that on the chopping block of being something that you can actually change your desires towards, and you can replace that with something more beneficial.
That's good. Yeah. So just being completely honest with you guys. So
what have you been this whole time? What have you been prior to now?
Well, I'm transitioning into this new segment, this new phase of the podcast.
The honesty segment.
So the first part, I do think that at this stage of life, 5 children is easier. That said, I do think where it gets a lot more complicated to have a lot more children is once they start leaving the nest.
No doubt.
Because you're never done being a parent. And I think that's something that the world really sells us, and it's just unhelpful because it's not true. And you will always care for your children. You will always want to see them succeed, and you are going to care when they're single, when they're on their own, when they're dating, when you're hoping that they find a godly spouse, once they're married to that person and they're trying to conceive, or they're raising your grandchildren, or, they're going to go through challenges in their own marriage. Like, you never stop caring as a parent or wanting to be there and support your children. And so I have seen, this is just observation, but my fear that I have to give to the Lord is my inability to be who my children need me to be as they go through those years, 16, 17, 18, as you are launching them into adulthood, and then tracking them through adulthood as, maybe they move across the country, or they, as their lives get really big, then your life starts to exponentially expand.
Yes.
And that's the beautiful thing about family. Like, I think that's why God intended his gospel to spread through family, is because it spreads and it starts to compound very quickly.
Yeah.
Once children leave the nest, start families of their own, then you have 1 million grandkids. That's what I want in life, but it terrifies me as well, because I don't want to, fail my children at that stage, I guess.
Yeah. I mean, that's, again, if we were to be honest, which here we are, that would probably be our biggest reluctance towards really having a ton of kids, right? It's because right now we have 5, we'd love more. But when we start talking like max number, how many we would love to have, what would be the ideal number? It's not while they're young. It's not while we're homeschooling them. It's not while they're all living under our roof.
It's not like 10 kids under our roof. Like,
scares us like
that's
that.
totally doable in
Yes.
my mind.
Yeah. What starts to overwhelm us is thinking of having, the combination of 4 young adults and then, 6 kids that are still in school, or a 6-year-old, and then you're a grandma as well. And you're trying to
breastfeeding and
Yeah,
a grandma.
you're
Like that
breastfeeding
could
and a grandma.
honestly be really real for us.
Exactly. And then dealing with just the challenges of young adults versus the kids' problems now are so simple. Our life is so simple right now. And so thinking of more of that, it's like, yeah, these guys are awesome. But 14-year-olds probably, challenges with your 14-year-old are going to be far, I don't know. Like, again,
They just
we're not
take
there.
More time,
They do.
I believe.
Yes.
They just, like, kids need you to be there to just like process. And I've seen families do it really well. We interviewed, there's people that give me hope for this. Who did we interview? The Epic Family Road Trip father is one of 15 kids.
Yeah.
And on the podcast, he was just sharing how his dad would like stay up till 2 a.m. and just chat with him and visit with him. And he just had such a personal relationship with his father as one of 15 children.
Yeah.
And so that's something that like gives me hope. I'm sure he wasn't the only child out of the 15 that his dad was always there for.
Sure.
And so I see people do it, and I know the Lord gives grace for it.
Right. But that, again, if we were using our own wisdom here, if we were leaning on our own understanding, it's our fear of that season that could lead to us wanting to limit family size, children count. And yet again, that's us. I don't want to lean on my own understanding, right?
No, and fear also isn't of the Lord.
No.
So you try to sort through, like, is this discretion here, or is this, just our human reasoning and a fear that the Lord, like, that's what he walks you through through all relationships. You kind of it's a trust walk.
Yes.
In your marriage, while you're parenting your children. Like, we have no clue, if one of our children if we have a special needs child, or if you just don't know what you can handle.
Yes.
Or what is going to happen in the future or now.
Right.
And so it's a total faith walk, and you can't reason it all perfectly on a spreadsheet and have it all plan out for you.
Yes, exactly. And so we want to live in faith. And I think, so instead of, like you said, living into that fear or letting it, dictate family size, it's, I think, bringing it to counsel and then saying, okay, is there something valid here? Like, is there a danger in being flippant in those younger years so that you don't think it's going to be an issue? Because we've talked about this before. There can be almost this, like on one extreme, you've got parents that don't want to have a certain number of kids because they've budgeted it all out to the every extreme. They know how much each kid's going to cost to get through college and how much it's going to, and so they can only afford it. It's like ultra planned. And you're like, well, that's not how it works. Like, the Lord's going to provide. And so you have on one extreme people that are scared to have a lot of children because of the practical things, that go along with having a lot of children. But then I think a reaction to that can be like, hey, no, it doesn't matter. It'll all work itself out. And you're like, well, actually, you should think some of these things through. I'm not saying don't have a lot of kids, but yes, realize there is going to be, and maybe this is our takeaway from having this apprehension to that future season. It's not living in fear, and it's not letting it dictate, what we do for family size, but bringing it to the Lord and thinking, okay, how can we then equip ourselves? How can we grow now as people so that we can be that parent to the 19-year-old as well as the parent to the 7-year-old, or or the parent to our young married children and grandparents, while still having, because I think you can do it, but I think you need to also be aware of the true challenge that is, and not just treat it like, oh, it'll work itself out. You're like, well, a lot of times it doesn't. Like, a lot of times that goes very poorly for families. And so you can't just say, it's fine, it's going to work itself out. But I also don't want to run away from it because of fear.
Yeah, I think there is a differentiation there. Like, I think that you can have exceptional big families, small families, all those things, but it doesn't just work itself out. Charlotte Mason has a great quote, and she says, well, the Lord, yes, will be faithful to your children, but it will be a lot harder on them unless you do your part, essentially, and so, yeah, like, the Lord has our children. He's going to be there for our shortcomings, but it can be a very hard life. And some children, you might be a listener on the podcast where your life is a lot harder because your parents weren't there for you in certain ways. And it doesn't mean that the Lord wasn't faithful through that, and that your life isn't fruitful, but it can be a lot harder on you. And I don't want that for our children. I want them to really feel like we were there for them every step of the way. And I do think, I mean, my mom is my hero and your mother, and both of them were having grandchildren while still homeschooling, like middle schoolers, like,
or younger. Yeah.
or younger. I had a baby and my youngest sister was 4. So my mom was very much in the thick of raising her own children and becoming a grandma. And she's done such a great job of that. But I guess I've looked at her life and I'm like, how do you like not kick into grandma mode with your own kids? Because you still are in mama mode with your own kids for like another decade.
Yes.
While you have these grandkids that are like the same age as your kids. And it's just,
Wow.
that's why, sufficient unto the day is the evil thereof. And you just cannot, I mean, this is what I tell Elisha is I'm like, I know so many of these arguments are wrong because I hear them from people who will limit their family to like 1 child or 2 children. And I'm just like, that's totally wrong. Like, you're reasoning this all wrong. I've been in a big family and like, you have limitless love. You can give every child, having another sibling is not taking away anything from the child. Like, I believe all these things to a point, but then my brain breaks. And then I start applying all this same logic to 5 or 6 kids instead of 1 or 2 kids.
Right.
Right. And so I catch myself being like, I'm using the same arguments that I know are false.
Yep.
Because I hear people use them for smaller family sizes. But then I'm using them for a slightly bigger family size, but unwilling to trust that at like 10 or 11 children, the same things will be true.
Yeah, because I think in my own reasoning, I don't know how it is for you. It's like I can picture having, 6, maybe 7 young adult children. Some of them are married. Some of them are looking for spouses. But it's like if they're all kind of more or less in the same season, that seems very manageable in my brain.
Like high school and up when they're getting married.
Yeah, exactly.
Elisha and I have this like 7, like we can mentally handle 7.
Yeah, exactly. And it's not for the season of when they're little. It's the season that we're projecting on the future, which again, we don't even have that. The Lord has all of our days numbered. It would be so silly to like make decisions. I guess it's not. We are supposed to like look forward and make plans. But when it comes to children, like it would be silly to be like, well, no, we're capping it off here because when our youngest is, 16, we want to make sure our oldest is only whatever, 29 or something, so that they're all in this like, tight pack, because that's how it makes the most sense to me as far as my capabilities, where I'm like, hey, I think I could be a good dad, and give them wisdom if there's that many and they're roughly around the same age. But again, just leaning on my own understanding. It's funny.
Yeah, I know all our logic is wrong, but here you guys, you're literally being a fly on the wall to Elisha's and Katie's fertility conversations. Clearly, we're having a lot of them with you guys recently.
Yeah, I wonder. Yeah.
This is probably unhealthy.
Well, it makes sense. It's like our youngest is, it's about that time. Our youngest is what, 10 months or how
10
old?
months
10
old.
months, and
so we've been having a lot of these conversations, and honestly, they've been conversations that we've had, and what's for years, and it's been really cool to see how the Lord continues to grow us, because we have just ended up being like, well, one more, we can do one more, and really that's all the Lord asks of us, is just following in faith for the next step. And just growing and allowing our children to mold us into the people that the Lord wants us to be. And Lord willing, we'll be different people in 5 or 10 years, dramatically different people. And just like that much more dependent on the Lord, that much more knowledgeable of the Lord. And so I guess I would say though, I think it gets way more complicated. I don't think it gets easier the more children you have. Once you hit high school and beyond, launching young adults, I think it's way easier to have 2 or 3 children and launch them at that stage.
Yes.
So little years, but you hit a threshold where it actually becomes easier.
Yeah.
Big years, you have to grow into a very capable humble, dependent on the Lord person, or you don't survive that season.
Yeah, which is probably the type of life we should be seeking to live as Christians.
That's who I want to be.
Because we're totally, fooling ourselves if we think we're doing anything in our own strength. Whether that's one child or two children, it is our full dependency is on the Lord in each of those seasons. And I do think growth is a part of God's divine plan with his children. And so continuing to grow is also a part of the equation. And so I think that's probably why, I've got this cap in my brain, is because deep down, I know I'm going to have to totally change as a person, even change my desires, change goals, change, ideals for my lifestyle, that, I'm subconsciously like not wanting, I'm like, well, like
I can still hang on to those.
Yeah, exactly. I can still have these things in my practical life potentially with this number of kids, or I could have this much quality time, or Katie and I could have this type of these go on these types of trips, or like whatever, like we could live in this type of house, and it calculates, it computes when I think of this many kids, and I think and so saying that, this is what I was going to say. So seeing that I need to grow is part of it. Like, okay, well, I'm going to continue need to grow my entire life, like what your mom was recently saying. However, children, and I think this is probably what you and I were both saying, it doesn't automatically mean that you're going to grow just because you have more children. No. You still have to make the decision to grow. Because I think people can embrace the 4 or 5 or 6, and like, this is awesome, just keep them coming. But then they don't put in the work to grow themselves. And then the kids end up suffering, or their spouse ends up suffering in those later years, because they're like, this is only good, right? It's all fun. Children are a blessing. Let's just keep having as many as possible. And maybe the dad doesn't, put forth an effort to grow his earning capability. And so it's because it's like, yeah, it does cost more money. And so do something about that. Like, project down the road and say, well, then I'm going to grow my earning, capacity, or maybe you don't take care of your health. And so your energy is then, waned, or relational, whatever. I don't know. I'm trying to think of circumstances, but I think it can happen. I think it does happen where people will say, just keep having more kids, but then they don't realize that's also going to require more of them, and they need to then grow more and accept that. And so I feel like it's the whole, you're growing in responsibility as you grow in family size. And what are you doing with that responsibility? And I think that's probably why, there's that check in me to be like, well, I do know what that would require. If I had more and more children, I would need to continue to grow. I would need to continue to let go of some ideals that I have, or preferences that I have. And of course, it's worth it. And of course, you would enjoy it if you truly did grow and lean into it and lean into the Lord and grow in the Lord. So,
yeah, I think for me, I was telling Elisha this, again, this is one of my I know this is faulty, but my logic is like, okay, the only reason I would actually want to stop potentially having children is not for my own sake, but because I would feel like potentially it's selfish. Like, I would like to just keep having children, but then I'm not able to keep up on what I would like to give the older children, or have the consistency to maintain that type of intentionality through every single child. So I can bring them into the world. I love the baby. I love having my children around me, but then I'm not able to deliver the results I would like to deliver educationally. As a home educator, I think that's a big intimidation factor for me, is to give each one of our children the same amount of input that way, educationally and academically, experientially.
Yep. And
that's where you just have to give it to the Lord. And like you said, grow, and not just say, well, okay. I mean, that's why I respect so much the marriages of couples that I know that have this wide span of children when they've done it well, is because like their marriage is so deep and so rich, and it's because of the trials that have happened and them having to force a closeness through all those years and all the relationships that they have going on and that they're navigating.
Yep.
It doesn't just happen that you have a great marriage with any amount of children, but there's a lot of relational strain when you have a lot of relationships where you're responsible for them.
Yep.
So you have to really grow that marriage. You have to really grow yourself. You have to really grow your relationship with the Lord.
Yep. Well, it's again, I go back to my dad. He was and is the dad that somehow like gave each one of his not just young children, but his young adult children, because those are, I think, more emotionally intensive, time intensive years, right? Those adolescent into young adulthood, into dating and finding careers. And I think of the hours and hours and hours. My dad, it was the 2 a.m. conversations of me just stressed out on life, having questions about my faith when I'm 16, like what's true, what's not, dealing with sin, dealing with, or differently going into the dating years and trying to sort stuff out. And it's like, in retrospect, I'm like, how did he do that? Like, how did he pour into each one? And I know for a fact, all my siblings would say the same thing, that are now grown. We're all grown now and most of us are married. And he was there for those endless conversations, right? No time, no agenda, no timeline. Even though we did go to bed at 2 a.m., we could have stayed up and watched the sunrise because he was there for me to work it all out. And anyways, it's crazy to think about what the growth, the full commitment he had in each. He didn't ever stop, right? He wasn't like, this is fun. I love, like, and he still does.
Both of your parents.
Yeah. So I guess it's just as I have gotten older, once again, here in my old age, I'm realizing all that entails. Because when you're young, when I'm 17, having those conversations with my dad or whatever, I don't think about what it's actually costing him, right? Because it's all I knew. And I'd seen him do it with my older siblings. I was like, this is just life. And now that I'm an adult and you start realizing like, oh, okay, that's your time. That's your energy. That's your emotional bandwidth. It's going in. And he was just giving it to me and all my siblings, right? Just pouring into us. And now I think it's, as I'm getting older, I'm like, oh, that's like that takes something, right? Anyways, it's not that I don't want to, as I'm saying, I'm like, I want to be that type of man. Like I want to be that person for my children, regardless of the number that the Lord blesses us with. I want to be present like that in the way that my dad was through those young adult years.
Yeah. So anyways,
Yeah.
what was it? Was it with Gary, who we just interviewed, and he was saying small lives don't make big marriages? Is that what
something?
he said?
Yeah, he said something good. But I do. There was that line. He's like, "Don't worry about falling out of love. Like worry about falling out of purpose." I think, and I think it was around the same time that he was said that line that you're referencing. Yeah, he was just
dropping one-liners.
And
so good.
It is so good. And even in going through this conversation, I do think that like the cap of children that I've had in my brain was heavily dependent on there being like that. A certain way that I really was preferring in my future self and to spend those golden years, right? Like being like, well, I want to get to, it's like, I don't know. I don't want to say too much here, but it's just been interesting to think through why I had that cap in my brain for that number of children.
Yeah. I think it's for the kids. It is what it is for me. And again, I hear people use that with other numbers that I just don't think it's accurate. So then I'm like, well, now I second guess myself.
Right.
Thinking that, it would be for the kids.
Yeah, because if it is, because I don't think as for the kids as for me as it is for you, but it is a part of it for me because it's like I want to be present for my kids. I want them to get the best of me to be able to equip them. We just are finishing reading the like that second book in the Three Musketeers series, and Athos, has a son now who's 15, and that gave him new life, that gave him new energy, and he's been pouring his time and efforts and money and energy into his son to equip his son. And now his son's, a total stud. And I think every father has a desire to do that with their sons and their daughters, to pour into them and to equip them. And there comes a point, and I think where you have to let go of your ego, and you're like, well, the Lord's going to be the one that equips these children. And I think he will do it through me because the way he's ordained it, the father's playing an integral role in their life and their spiritual formation and in their practical formation. And I do want that for my children as well.
And there is an element too, as I know we need to end here, but like where kids can learn skills that maybe they wouldn't otherwise have done. Like
Amen.
A level of independence or a level of confidence even in their own capability, because they're required to be capable and they're required to have a certain amount of independence that can be really healthy and propel them through life. We did an episode a while back where we had a Q&A where a grandma was helping out her daughter. And we got a lot of comments on that of women, everyone sharing their opinions. And I really appreciate that. I love you guys sharing your opinions in the comments. And some gal saying, well, you should totally expect grandma to help out, like that's not a big deal if she's watching kids 8 hours a day or whatever.
A week. Yeah.
A week. Yeah, exactly. A week. If it's 1 day or 2 days a week, like that's not a big deal. And I think it's funny because we're coming at this from a little different mindset in that I really I believe that the vision for family is expansion and multiplication and dominion. I believe that that's God's vision for family. And so there's no way, I guess, like my perspective when I come into a conversation like that is there's no way my mother, who has 8 daughters, has a daughter-in-law, we're all having babies out the wazoo, is going to physically be able to show up at any of our house for any amount of consistent days. My mom does an amazing job of showing up a week after we give birth. And she's done that so far for all of us girls and just pampers us, takes care of our family, feeds us meals. Like she is there. She's there when I need to call her. She's there if, she's there for me and she's there as a grandma. But hopefully our families are growing to such an extent that it's impossible for grandma to have that consistent daily childcare role.
Right.
That is my hope for my children, is that I have so many grandchildren that I am unable to be a child caregiver.
Right.
And I can show up and I can spoil the grandkids and I can send them presents and I can, show up on special event days or whatever that is. Elisha and I can fly into town, but it's like our life has multiplied out beyond me. And I think that in our Western world, we have a perspective where if we're still relying so heavily on the generation behind us, then we aren't really multiplying, because we can only multiply as much as that generation can still handle.
Yeah.
Instead of taking more on ourselves
Sure.
and expanding it out,
Yep.
So I just think that that's something that's like, I guess I want to let you guys know that's my perspective coming into this, is I just feel like I want to be raising my daughters to be able to handle more than I could handle for them.
Right.
Or my sons as well. So.
And that's who really, like you mentioned this a while back too, just teaching our children to fish rather than, rather than just giving them the fish. Right.
Yeah.
And I think that that's the mindset you need to have. If you're going to have, if you just have one child, then you're going to have a lot more bandwidth as a grandparent, or if you have two children. But if you want to have a larger than average family, it's incumbent upon you at that point to equip your children to be able to, manage their own households, right? To truly leave and cleave. And then you can be in that role of support and of fan and of grandparent.
You could be like the icing on the cake, like the fun.
Total bonus, right?
But not the necessities.
Yeah.
And I think of that with, I guess what I'm saying is I think that could potentially be a good thing. Maybe all the things I want to give my children, time-wise, experience-wise, all these things, they can learn more if we aren't actually able to helicopter parent them as much.
Right.
Because there is a sheer number, and they have to go out and do some things on their own that builds into them. So there is that. So much can be gained by this hands-on support, and there is so many things that can be gained by hands-off support as well.
Yes.
And the Lord works through both. So I don't think that needs to be a fear of ours.
Right.
When raising kids.
Amen.
Anyways.
Well, there you have it, folks. You truly are in the midst of a real-time conversation with Katie and Elisha. And so, I don't know, hopefully we didn't say too many things we regret, but folks, thank you for listening. If you do enjoy this podcast, please, give it a thumbs up or hit the subscribe button. Talk to you soon. Bye-bye.
Bye.